And today I'm here with Kathleen Kendall-Tackett. I'm very excited to be here and to talk with you, Kathy. We are really committed together to do these projects to help women understand more, and more than women, their partners and the whole systems that they're in, about the impact of birth trauma. So I'm wondering, Kathy, if you would just talk a little bit about yourself so people can get to know you a little.
Okay, sure. I'm happy to. I'm a health psychologist, but by training and background, I've spent most of my career doing work in trauma. Started in family violence and actually kind of have moved to kind of a more general trauma. I was one of the founders of the American Psych Association Trauma Division of Trauma Psychology, and I now edit their journal. I've edited the journal for the last 7 years. So that actually working in that, sort of arena, setting up the trauma division and working on the journal actually gave me a much more broad perspective in terms of understanding trauma, which I think was good because it's like the trauma field tends to be pretty siloed. You have your disaster people, you have your interpersonal violence people, and then you have the people who study, people who've been through combat, or war. And so it's like those three silos have been very separate, and trauma division sort of brought them all together. And I really feel I have actually learned a lot more general trauma stuff from being with the other two groups, which has been really helpful for me in terms of, how then can we apply this to birth? And this is actually a topic I first became interested in when I was working on a very first book back in 1992, working on a book on postpartum depression, and my reading of the literature was telling me something different than what I was hearing at conferences, which was everybody was talking about, oh, it's estrogen and progesterone, and that's the only thing that causes it. And I just didn't believe it. And I actually was the first to use a PTSD framework to talk about birth. You couldn't really diagnose this back then because the DSM criteria at the time for trauma, a traumatic event was something that was outside the realm of human experience because it was still early in the diagnosis phase. And it's like they had developed the diagnosis based on the experiences of Holocaust survivors, people who'd been sexually assaulted, people who'd been in combat, so there had been these really extreme events. And so that was how they actually defined trauma. The diagnosis has actually evolved. So now what they call the event criteria, or the traumatic event, actually does include birth. But I remember actually reading one of the very first books on it. It was edited by Charles Figley, who many consider to be the father of the PTSD diagnosis. And I remember reading the different chapters and thinking, this applies to birth. And so many of the women that I interviewed for the book, they would, it was all via phone and via, correspondence via mail and stuff at the time. But I remember actually when I would first talk to them, they'd say, my depression was caused by hormones. And then they'd go on and tell me about some horrific birth experience.
Yeah.
And it was like, one of the women, I will never, ever forget this woman. In fact, we stayed in touch for many years after. She experienced an unmedicated cesarean.
I know those who've suffered stuff like that. It's,
I remember just being like sick to my stomach after I heard that story. I thought it was just awful. And, she was a nurse at the hospital it happened. She kept telling them, I can feel this. And they said, no, you can't. And then it got to a point where the pain became overwhelming. And she said the nurse next to her stood there and just sobbed during this whole, and it's like, the doctors didn't pay attention to this. They just finished it. And then she had a roaring case of PTSD after that they misdiagnosed as postpartum psychosis, and they hospitalized her, took her away from her baby. So you'd hear these stories like this and you're thinking, how are you talking about this as still being related to hormones?
Yes, I know. I still hear stories like that even today, and it's 2021. Yeah. So it's 40 years later, or how 30 years later, and we haven't improved.
No. And some of the stories that, were really just have been so appalling, and also too, it's like, I'm also very interested in kind of what happens to the providers, particularly, yep. People who are in more secondary positions. They're not the primary providers. Right. They're the nurses, they're the doulas, yes. They're the witnesses to the event. And it's like, if you read like Cheryl Beck's qualitative stuff with labor and delivery nurses, what they've experienced and these experiences of these women and the fact that they were witness to it and they couldn't do anything to stop it,
Yes.
has haunted them for
Yes.
years. Yeah. In fact, Cheryl and I, we just did a paper together, and we actually took, I took her qualitative data and I actually put it up against the framework of moral injury rather than secondary trauma. Because when she wrote the paper in 2012, the moral injury stuff was still pretty much, completely isolated in the literature in combat and stuff. And it really hadn't been sort of broadened. What a moral injury is that you are forced to participate in something or witness something that you believe to be wrong. And again, if you think about that, what happens in a combat,
right.
Setting,
right.
And that's actually how it's been used, and then realizing that there was something else on top of the post-traumatic stress disorder that was actually in some ways making it even harder to heal from, and it was this guilt and shame that's not really part of the PTSD diagnosis, but it's another piece of it, and it can lead in some ways to sort of an existential crisis too, that you really stop believing in the goodness of humanity or that right will out in the end. I mean, it really can lead to a lot of these like bigger questions in the universe. But anyway, so that's actually kind of like how I got interested in doing it. Because again, all I had to do was just sort of map, what these women were saying to me in interviews with what the symptom criteria were for PTSD. And I said, look, this matches. I said, I know you can't diagnose it this way, but this matches.
Yes.
And I still remember one of the things that Figley said in the intro to the book. And he said, thinking about all these kind of diverse types of traumatic experience. And I thought this applied to birth so well. He said, an event will be troubling to the extent that it is sudden, dangerous, and overwhelming.
Yes.
And I remember actually talking to some of the mothers I interviewed, and I said, look, let me try this out on you, see what you think about it. And it resonated with them, because in almost every case, that's kind of what had happened. It had started off fine, then it got to be super dangerous, and it happened in a blink of an eye.
Yes.
Totally unexpected, and that they had no way that they could do anything about it. Sudden, unexpected, and completely overwhelming.
It's not even during birth. Sometimes after birth, things happen with the baby and happen
Right.
with her body. So, I mean, it's yeah. I'm really glad we're starting to do more and more, and that you and I have partnered in this, because we're both so passionate. And I read constantly and trying to understand and get more data and help people just really understand what can we do about birth trauma and how do we frame it. And you've been one of the early progenitors who has really framed it, and everybody quotes you like how they do, like well, rates of PTS and rates of birth trauma. I mean, you have documented things so extremely well, because you are a researcher and you are passionate about literature, but you also are a provider, and you also are helping women understand not only what happens during birth, but breastfeeding. I mean, you're an IBCLC too, right?
Right. Yeah. And I mean, it's funny because it's like I got involved with doing the lactation stuff because it was supposed to be kind of the fun, happy counterpart to my work in trauma and depression and all that. But then pretty soon, different groups started asking me to speak on it, because they wanted me to talk about depression. They wanted me to talk about the impact of child sexual abuse. And I thought, I honestly, especially with talking about the impact of child sexual abuse, at the time they were asking me, there was no research on it, none. We do have actually a lot now, but we didn't then. And it's like, but I remember actually telling my boss, I said, I think I'm gonna have to get into this. I said, because what people are saying really doesn't actually make a lot of sense to me. But yeah, that's how those kind of ended up merging. But of course, when people say, well, can birth trauma impact breastfeeding? Of course it can. Of course it can.
Yes.
And in fact, it can have an immediate effect, because those, when you activate that sort of 3-part stress system, which includes the inflammatory response and the fight or flight and the HPA axis, you access all of those, you're suppressing the 2 hormones involved with lactation, oxytocin and prolactin, and you're directly suppressing those. And so it's kind of like, are we surprised then? And a lot of times people think, oh, well, it doesn't really make any difference. It doesn't make any difference. It's like, and I'm thinking, this is what I keep saying is when I talk to lactation consultants, is like, pay attention during that first week. She can get into massive amounts of trouble during that time. If her, lactogenesis 2, or when they call milk coming in more abundantly, if that gets delayed for several days, they can end up, mom and baby can end up in a lot of trouble, and
Yes.
baby can end up back in the hospital. It can really be,
Yes.
very problematic. So it's like they need professionals to be diligent and paying attention to this.
Yes, and I'm interested in training professionals to be right there on the front line to understand what they see and what to do about it, because I know what to do about it. And so I'm so glad. Like, I feel like you and I could talk all day, and in fact, we could do get a chance.
I think we've tried a few times.
Well, I don't know. I feel like I just love listening to the stories of how all this is developed, because here we are now. It's 2021. Birth trauma hasn't gotten better. It's gotten worse, actually. COVID has made it worse. Postpartum anxiety, antenatal anxiety, depression, and then, here we are at this very precious moment of this family crossing a threshold into connection at all baby mom partner. There's so much we could do here, and to try and improve. That this is a place where we can actually easily improve if we could get everybody in sync or in harmony around birth.
Right. Well, and also too, like I've actually always been of the belief, and with both depression and things like birth trauma, is it's like, if we can catch this early, I think we can prevent a lot of the spiral that goes down.
No,
if we see it early, and it's like we can actually then bring in the support that family needs, because it really affects everybody. Oftentimes, if a mom is traumatized, so is the partner who actually saw this and couldn't do anything about it.
That's right.
Or they're wondering why you're making such a big deal out of it. But either way is going to cause problems.
Yes. And the baby too, like the baby uses their whole body to breastfeed. And if they have trauma in their body, and also really the whole family makes sense of it, but really helping a baby breastfeed and understanding what happened to them, a baby body worker is what I am. And so really helping bring bodywork skills of connection, skills of trauma resolution. And then we can go also into the systems that you are all been analyzing so much, like all these statistics, and then understanding this moral injury and what happens for the staff. It's this holistic sort of, let's go in on every level, and we know how to do that now.
Yeah. And the question I have is, why are we still having this?
I know, it's a good question.
There are systems that are allowing this, and it's like, that to me is kind of the bigger question, is it's like, what on earth, on what other area of medicine can you allow this level of abuse to take place and not address it?
Yeah, I agree.
It blows my mind.
I just want to.
It's at least 30 years on, but obviously it's been going on a lot longer than that.
Oh no, it's incredible what's going on, and I think there are places I've seen change, and we can talk more about that at another time. But I do feel like we're going to start. You and I are starting here. We're going to have our first event, which is Birth in Pieces, which is happening on January the 15th. We're going to show this documentary that you told me about, that you said at a conference. Is that right?
Yeah, it was down in El Paso, and I just was really blown away by it. And the two directors of it were there actually, and I got a chance to meet them. They gave me a copy of it, which I really appreciated. And I told you about it because I just said, boy, I really think that this deserves a much broader audience. People need to see this. It's really an incredible piece of work.
It is. I've watched it, and it just helped listening to the women and their experiences. And that's what's happening on a huge level. In our country, we are one of the bigger offenders of birth trauma in the world, but it's happening in all different parts of the world. So
I would say, honestly, we're probably in the middle of the pack. We're not the worst, but we're definitely not the best.
Okay, well, that's good to know.
Yeah.
And then
places that are worse, but it's like, it's pretty. I mean, talk to somebody who's had a baby. Well, I won't mention any countries, but there's some countries where it is even actually, I think, more difficult. But it's like, I think the thing that people kind of don't get is, like, even in these industrial countries that have a lot of money that they spend on healthcare, this is still happening. And it's like, that's the thing that is just wrong. And, sometimes, honestly, there are going to be a small percentage of cases where it's unavoidable.
It's true.
Okay? It could be there's a medical emergency, something like that. But it's like all these other ones, it's like provider manner and provider like decisions and stuff that are made. But in any of those cases, let's bring on site the support. We see something like this happening. We don't just send them home.
Right. We know now how to help. And it'd be nice if every hospital had somebody who knew how to right away come in and help with cases that are, there's a wide variety of trauma.
There definitely is.
So on the 15th, we're going to show this documentary, and then you and I are going to have a discussion about it. I've invited Nicole Cobb, who's one of the directors, to come help. And then we're going to have 4 presentations, and you're our first one. So would you be willing just to share with people what you're going to talk about?
Oh, sure. I'd be happy to. What I'm going to basically do is give kind of a overview of the field of birth trauma, like what we know about it from research. And so I want to actually, first of all, present the, what we call the DSM-5, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual criteria for diagnosing trauma. And the reason I want to kind of do that is because I think it's helpful to see the sort of range of symptoms that encompasses the, understanding PTSD. And even if people don't necessarily meet all the criteria for getting a diagnosis of PTSD, you can have a lot of people that also have just symptoms of it.
Yes.
And so sometimes people, especially if they've experienced it, they may not realize that some of the things that they're experiencing, are symptoms of trauma. And they just think, oh, well, that's just the way it is. Or, I've had mothers tell me, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm losing my mind. And it's like, that's one thing I kind of want to do, is put a frame on it. And also for practitioners, I want practitioners to say, look, this is the constellation of symptoms, to kind of be looking for. And this is kind of what has it. And sometimes just giving it the name sometimes can be the very first step in healing. So I think that's really important to do. And then I'm going to kind of go through the studies. I'm going to talk a little bit about the risk factors for it. What do we know of the risk factors? I'm going to talk about the incidence, and that's when we'll do that sort of country by country kind of comparison, and we'll find something. And something that was really interesting that just jumped out to on that literature review I just did, that I told you we did with Cheryl Beck. I did with Cheryl Beck. One thing that was really interesting is I was looking at the rates of secondary trauma in midwives in studies. And the interesting thing is they mirrored in that same country the rates of birth trauma in the mothers. They lined up almost exactly. That so where there's low rates of secondary trauma for the providers, there tend to also be extremely low rates of birth trauma for the mothers. And so it's like, that to me, doesn't that kind of speak systemically to you?
Yes. So it'll be very interesting to hear all the things that you have to say. So that'll be your presentation.
So that'll be, So it'll be just kind of like a summary of the research literature and some stories. We'll also going to talk a little bit about the Cheryl Beck's research on how it impacts breastfeeding.
Oh, yes, that would be good too. I think that's very good. And then after you will become my presentation, and I'm going to talk about this 3-fold path that I've developed to help women recover. And I see them get better right away with the way I've managed to create a pathway. In fact, I had a mother tell me yesterday, she said, I'm so glad I found you, because I can see there is a path I'm going to walk down, and I can see that I'm going to get better.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, she felt better right away after our first session. And I find that that's very common, that women, after they meet with me or any of my graduates, they get a sense of, I'm going to get better. I know what I have now. And even normalizing some of the things, all the things that you've talked about, like, this is a traumatic experience I had, and I'm not crazy, and it's not my fault. And then women get better right away, and they feel such relief and so much gratitude. So I'm really looking forward to doing this event with you, Kathy, and I'm so grateful to you for joining me, because where 2 or more are gathered, there's just going to be hopefully between the 4 of us, there's you and I, and then Kimberly Ann Johnson and Molly Carol May. And so this is our first day where we're going to walk women and families through, and hopefully we'll do another one for providers, where we can really begin to make some inroads into helping our cultures change around birth and welcoming families into being families.
Well, and Kate, I've been actually super impressed with how you've put all this together, and I'm really excited. I think this is going to be a really amazing event, and I think it's really going to help a lot of people.
Oh, good. Well, thank you so much for coming on today, Kathy, and talking with me. And for those of you out there listening, our event is January the 15th, 2022. We start at 9. The documentary Birth in Pieces is free. We'll have to register you for that. And the links are all in this YouTube recording, but also then we have these workshops or presentations with Kathy, myself, Kimberly Ann Johnson, and Molly Carol May. So, all right. Thank you very much, Kathy, and see you later.
Bye, Kate.